All right, so I want to introduce our esteemed guests. Today we're joined this evening by Professor Ashley Howard. She received her PhD in history from the University of Illinois and is a faculty member at the University of Iowa. Her research interests include African Americans in the Midwest, the intersections between race, class, and gender, and the global history of racial violence. She's currently completing her manuscript, which analyzes the 1960s urban rebellions in the Midwest, grounded in the way race, class, gender, and region played critical and overlapping roles in defining resistance to racialized oppression. Dr. Howard's work has appeared in the Black Scholar, No Jargon Podcast, Time Magazine, NPR, Al Jazeera, the Associated Press, BBC Mundo, and numerous other popular and scholarly outlets. As an educator, Dr. Howard's primary goal is to teach students to be effective writers, critical thinkers, and engaged global citizens. That's what we historians try to do. She's also dedicated to sharing her scholarly knowledge outside of the traditional campus community, including underserved schools and in correctional facilities. And of course, thanks to this series with the Sikh American community. Please, everyone, welcome Professor Ashley Howard.
Thank you, everybody, so much. It's such a delight to be here. Thank you to Kira and thank you to JD for putting this together. It is a great honor to be with you and to talk about some issues that are so very important in our lives and in our ongoing communities. So thank you very much for that opportunity. So as was said, I am a historian of racial violence, specifically the uprisings. But I'm also interested in social movements and how the uprisings and just social movements in general are actually a mechanism for change and the ways in which people remember and misremember history. So I really kind of want to land on some of those themes today as we have this conversation. And I'll open with a caveat. In the African American Christian tradition, there's often this phrase that the congregation will say to the preacher, speak it plain. That means cut out the fluff, the dribble, the ornamentation, and just give it to the people straight. And so that's really going to be my intention today. So I want to actually begin at the end. And so in my classroom, I always tell my students the takeaways. So these are the ideas that, when I am long gone, when they're no longer trying to get the grade, the things that I still want them to hold on to remember. So many things we can look up via our smartphones, right? That we don't have to have those details in our heads like we once did, but it's the so what of those details. Why do they matter? How do they impact our lives? That's what I really want us to focus on today. And for that reason, our two takeaways are, while oppression has remained constant, the shape shifts, and therefore the resistance must also adapt, right? And so I use the plural here because there are many ways to push back against that oppression. So that's the first takeaway. And the second is that social movements do not occur organically. It doesn't just happen spontaneous. There's a great deal of work that must be put into it, networks that must be built, and people that must be mobilized. So that's going to be kind of our two objectives that we're going to talk about today, and really thinking about the impact and how we can go from 1619 and slavery to the nadir, that low moment of Jim Crow after 1877, to kind of this uptick in the civil rights era to where we are today. All right. So one thing, well, there we go, we need to talk about is the stubbornness of race. And Jay Deep already discussed this a bit, but I want to talk about how these ideas become manifest in the direct and indirect institutional discrimination that he spoke of. So I like to begin with this, right? A board game. This was in the Los Angeles Times in 2014. And so you see two people going against this American dream game. And the white person says, are you just slow or what? Right? And if you see his track, you see free land from Indians, jump 2 spaces, free labor from enslaved people, take another turn. So he has quite a straight path. whereas the African American has a winding, twisting road, including slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, gang culture, all of these types of things that are part of the institutional structure of America, making that journey forward much, much longer. So on the whole, race is often seen as a master category. This idea that all of our identities, be it religion or gender or sexuality, are read through. And by nature, as humans, that's what we do. We categorize things, male or female, child or adult, East Coast versus West Coast, right? So the act of making categories of people is actually universal. And because of that, there's great variation over historical time and space. So something that may be understood as Black in 1870 is not necessarily understood to be Black today. And it's also culturally relevant. So if we take the example of age, in Japan, where age and being an elder is venerated, people often lie about their age to seem more important than they actually are. Whereas in the United States, you know, if you watch enough Lifetime TV, you'll find any number of products to make us look younger and firmer and more beautiful, right? Because we are a youth-driven culture. And so while it is normally accepted or widely accepted that race is a social construction, right? This is because it has no biological basis and this fluidity, right? It's fickleness. So even though it is understood as a racial category, it still has a profound effect on how it shapes our lives, be it politically, socially, culturally, economically. So how is it that we take this thing that's amorphous and a shapeshifter and made up, frankly, to have real impact on people's lives? And so the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed is a four-step process. So the first is that these corporal qualities, right? Skin tone, hair texture, various phenotypical issues or features begin to acquire meaning in social life, right? So if you have straight hair, that might mean one thing. If you have curly hair, that might mean another. Those racial meanings are then translated into social structures, high or low. If you have blonde hair, you're great. If you have dark hair, not so much. Those social structures then become imbued with privilege. Who gets to be on magazines? Who gets chosen as homecoming queen? And then that privilege becomes the way in which society is organized and ruled. So if you have blonde hair, you're the most beautiful, you get paid higher, you get more privileges in society. So it's this racialization, right, that puts value onto happenstance is what becomes so important in the context of not only the United States, but also the world. And thus race is neither self-evident nor an ocular function, meaning like you can't tell necessarily what somebody's race is because it's fluid and dependent. And so what we see coming out of this, because it's not obvious, it's not, oh, that person's Black, that person's Asian, it's more fluid and messy, we have racial projects being built. And so these racial projects are simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of racial identities and meanings. It's an effort to organize and distribute resources, economic, political, cultural, all along these racial lines. So if we think about what was said earlier about stereotypes, this is one way that stereotypes, right, people's misinformed beliefs about another actually have real impact in people's lives. So we see these racial projects as restrictive voting laws, immigration bans, organizing healthcare to be far away from communities of color, stop and frisk practices, you know, the wearing of an All Lives Matter buttons, wearing natural hair, pipeline products on indigenous lands. All of these things are ways to denote this person is better than or less than based on our racial hierarchy. And so each racial project is both a reflection of and a reaction to broader patterns of race in the overall social system, right? So the idea of wearing natural hair is a rejection of Eurocentric beauty norms, right? Black women are saying, no, I will wear the hair that grows out of my head, to hell with you and relaxers. So this is a very powerful way that people can make these racial identities. And this is all tied to structural violence. And so I opened this presentation talking about how I'm a scholar of violence. And while my immediate project looks at interpersonal violence, right? When people use force against another person, that is always tied to structural violence. And John Galtung, I think, has a very powerful statement of what structural violence looks like and how we need to be keyed into it, especially when we begin to talk about what this looks like in 2020. So Galtung writes, violence is here defined as the cause of the difference between the potential and the actual, between what could have been and what is. Violence is that which increases the distance between the potential and the actual, that which impedes the decrease of this distance, right? So if we think about the fact of disproportional deaths of Blacks and Latinx people when it comes to COVID, that is a form of structural violence. When we look at all those wonderful but heartbreaking statistics that this presentation began with, of incarceration, of the neuroscience which sees Black people immediately as a threat, that is a form of structural violence, impeding the difference between the potential to live a full life and the actual, to die of COVID because you're working in meatpacking plants. And so just so I can, really hammer home these terms, racism is a racial project that creates and reproduces structures of domination based on racial significance and identities. And what we should all be aspiring to is anti-racism, which is a racial project that undoes or resists structures of domination based on racial significance and identities. And for the whole of African American history, this is what many Black people have been engaging in, is to undo these racist structures of domination. But even though there have been these really wonderful moments that had the potential to be shining, glorious, transformational events in American history, race, and particularly anti-Blackness, still remains. And so what I want to do in the next section is to go very briefly through 3 turning moments, or potentially turning moments, in African American history, and talk about why race should not have survived that event, but in fact does. I want to end on this, and it's this section on this, and it's interesting because I actually had this in my slideshow before I read CNN this morning. So a teacher in Texas assigned this to talk about the recent events that are happening. And the Fraternal Order of Police is very upset about it. The governor of Texas sent out a tweet of it saying, how dare you compare today's police force to people who enslaved, who kidnapped Africans, the Ku Klux Klan, and sheriffs in a segregated South. Whereas I thought this was a very fitting image to the way that anti-Black practices continue on, even though the shape morphs, right? How they actually function changes. Okay, so let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. This should have been the biggest moment to right America's wrong at the very beginning of the nation, right? This is what's often known as the American paradox. The idea that simultaneously, as the founding fathers were developing a dedication to human liberty and dignity, they were buttressing a system that denied the liberty and dignity to thousands of others in the form of enslaved labor. This is also known as the American dilemma, the commitment to equality while practicing racism. And so numerous scholars have debated whether or not the Declaration of Independence and Constitution are pro or anti-slavery documents. But what we see is that African Americans and many other marginalized people in our community have used these documents as rhetorical ammunition, right, to push the American agenda of freedom forward. Now, let us not forget, the US bought their independence with slave labor, particularly thinking about tobacco production in Virginia, where 40% of enslaved people lived. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he did not even need to qualify that he wasn't talking about Black people, because to assume that is nonsense. Black people were not considered to be entities in which there were any rights to respect. And so what we see happening during the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War that follows is the centrality of Black enslavement in the discourse surrounding the British Empire's treatment of American colonists, right? To speak it plain, American colonists are figuring themselves to be enslaved and thus oppressed, even though they are buying and selling literal bodies of people who are enslaved. And just, Ben Franklin said that the British want to make American whites Black. John Adams, under the pseudonym of Humphrey Plowjogger, said, "We won't be their Negroes. Providence have never intended the American colonists for Negroes, and therefore never intended us for slaves. We are as handsome as old English folks, and thus should be as free." Yet another anonymous colonist in Pennsylvania wrote, "Are we not of the same stock? Was the blood of our ancestors polluted by a change of soil? Were they freemen in England, and then did they become slaves by a 6 weeks voyage to America?" And for many of our ancestors, the answer is yes. But the way that the colonists saw themselves was being oppressed, and thus showing an intimate and frankly perverse knowledge of slavery, because they themselves did not want to be enslaved. We must also put into context the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which expanded the landmass and thus necessitated the need for more enslaved labor. So all of these things come together in a moment that should be liberatory to actually increase the marginalization and the anti-Black racist project happening at this time. The next one, emancipation, right? The end of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, yay, Black people are free. But what we once again see is the mechanizations of the American racist state, creating laws and economic practices, providing African Americans without the opportunity to make good on the promise of this nation. And so Abraham Lincoln, who is, still really understood to be the great emancipator, his idea was we need to bring the Union back together as quickly as we can. I don't really care about the rights of the newly freed, formerly enslaved people. It's Frederick Douglass that gives us this moment of radical potential with his 30th anniversary speech to the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he gave a very eloquent and a novel voice, a radical, really, vision of what reunification could look like. He wrote, "We are fighting for something incomparably better than that of the old Union. We are fighting for unity in which there shall be no North, no South, no East, no West, no Black, no white, but a solidarity of the nation, making every slave free and every free man a voter." But throughout Reconstruction, lasting from about 1865 to 1877, every single one of those points was contested. After the presidential Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson, we see that there was just the changing same. We see the Black codes being put forth, which looked a lot like slave codes, restrictive labor contracts, not allowing African Americans to testify against people in court unless they were testifying against Black folks, fines for seditious speech or for possessing a gun. And by the time the December 1865 election rolled around in the former states of the Confederacy, the newly elected Southerners included the Vice President of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 5 Confederate colonels, 6 Confederate cabinet officers, and 58 members of the Confederate Congress were re-elected in the new reunified United States. And so while radical Reconstruction offered the possibilities of America finally making good on her promise, this was rolled back through what is known as the shotgun policy. And this was a campaign to use terrorist violence against African Americans and their white allies to ensure that Black people did not vote in their own interests. By the time we get to the Compromise of 1877, the South had been so-called redeemed from the radical Republicans who sought a vision of full inclusion for African Americans. And we see that once again, Black people were disenfranchised, disposable, and denigrated. Once again, Black people resisted, even though the texture of the oppression shifted, they still resisted. And the final way that I'm going to talk about in the historical context of them resisting was through the Great Migration. Due to a number of push and pull factors, beginning in the 1910s, African Americans began moving north and west in droves, understanding that freedom was a little bit more free in the north. But they abruptly discovered that the North had many of the same problems, even if it wasn't the explicit in-your-face racism of the South. In employment, they were often the first fired, the last hired. They had inferior housing at exorbitant rates. And of course, there was a resurgence of violence, which Jaydeep showed at the beginning of the presentation, pushing back against not only the lynchings, but also the race riots that happened in places like East St. Louis and Chicago. And this picture is one that is from the 1970s in Boston around busing. And so this idea of violence to terrorize people and to dissuade folks from participating in their rights is one that has a long history in this country. Okay, we have a little bit of time for this first segment. So if there are any quick questions that I could take, and then I'll move on to the next part.
Well, we don't have any questions yet.
Okay. Great.
But there are maybe a couple things we could talk about that you brought up that I think really resonate with the Sikh American community. The first thing is, I think the attacks on natural Black hair are something Sikh Americans can certainly relate to and understand intimately, because we've had to fight to fully participate in American society with our religious uniform. From children being teased and attacked in school, to racist teachers and principals and school boards, to discrimination in employment, housing, and public service. That's something I think the Sikh community can certainly relate to. And I hope they can begin to start to see some of the parallels of how white supremacy works against one group is often very similar to how it learns how to deal with other groups. And that's certainly been a central strain. And I mean, I know Ashley can testify, someone else who studies racial violence. That's something I've been obsessed with even before I became a scholar. Because I mean, I came of age in the 80s, and Reagan made racial violence became a headline again for the first time in a while. So the other thing was, if we could talk more about 1919, I think that's really incredibly significant. That period, I mean, you use the word term riots, and that's a term I think it's incredibly important. In 1984, there were pogroms that occurred, targeted massacres of Sikhs in New Delhi and throughout the Punjab. And could you talk more about these riots? Because to me, I think they're one of the most important moments in U.S. history, because this comes at a time when Black people were being lynched in huge numbers, but entire Black towns were being lynched. I mean, I came up with a list the other day of 38 that I came up off the top of my head, which major massacres of at least 5 people, and maybe maybe 2 dozen of them were actual towns, like when they burned Tulsa or Rosewood, or any of the other places in Forsyth County, Georgia. There's so many of them. So if you could talk more about that and Black people fighting back, and why in 1919 was the first time Black people really fought back against white people attacking their communities.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so important to note here that these instances of racial violence, even though the myth is that it is an attack by a Black man on a white woman, right? That's often usually the narrative surrounding lynching. More often than not, when you look at the source material published in white newspapers at the time, it's economic competition, right? A Black person was seen as, quote, too uppity, didn't know their place. They were threatening the social norms, or they were getting too successful. When we look at these racial uprisings, these riots that are happening in the North in the 1910s through 19 teens, really what we're seeing is fear of economic competition and fear of political competition. And so the idea is you just go into a community and annihilate it. And I think the one that's most notable in this is both Chicago in 1919 and Tulsa in 1921, because African Americans did take arms and fight back. And I think armed self-defense has a very long history in the Black community, even prior to emancipation. But these were events that had some emphasis, reciprocal violence, even though they were still, particularly in the case of Tulsa, Black Wall Street was just wiped off the face of the earth. And they're just now, like as in 2020, just now starting reclamation and archaeological digs to actually see what the impact of the damage there was.
The mass graves, right?
That's right. That's right. And mass graves. That's right.
Yeah. I feel like I took an awful long time, and I don't want to intrude on your presentation. So why don't we save the other questions I wanted to ask? Because again, like I said last time, we could do this all night.
It's true.
There's so many interesting aspects of Black history that I think the Sikh community should know about, but we don't really have time. So again, I want to give them a skeleton, and I hope they will, populate that skeleton with lots of flesh.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All
So
right.
it's good to keep on the body imagery. All right, so I'm going to duck back on to share screen. Good. All right, so making movement. So what I want you all to do right now is to close your eyes. We're going to pretend we're all in the same space here. Close your eyes, and when you think of the civil rights movement, right? When you think of that phrase, what images pop to your head? And I'm not going to go out of share screen to see your comments, but I can imagine what some of them might be. All right, does everybody have some down? Fantastic. So I'm guessing these are some of the images that you think of. Linda Brown with Brown versus the Board of Education, the 1963 March on Washington, and of course, Rosa Parks, Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955. And it is completely reasonable to think of these as some of the most key iconic moments in the civil rights struggle. However, the civil rights struggle did not, again, pop up organically. This was because African Americans had a greater sense of entitlement stemming from World War II, right? During World War II, we see the double victory campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. And so they're very much beginning to think about their roles in American society and the things in which that they are entitled to. And because Black men and women had recently been admitted into the industrial workforce with higher wages, they had served their countries, they saw racism in a different context. And they knew that they were valuable members of this nation. And so they began to agitate for the rights in, massive scale. Now, during the Great Depression, we begin to see this as labor organizing. But by the time we get to the Red Scare, all labor organizing was deemed as communist, and many Blacks left these kind of organizations. Because of this, they channeled their organization, strategy, militancy into local concerns in their own communities. So they are cutting their teeth on labor organizing, and they're learning tactics and skills and ways to do it, and then beginning to apply that to race issues. And not saying that race agitation hadn't happened before, but in this particular moment, right, in the interwar era and after World War II, we begin to see the groundwork being laid for the civil rights movement. So let's start with Brown versus the Board of Education. This was the landmark Supreme Court case which declared that the state law establishing separate public schools for Black and white students is unconstitutional, thus overturning the 1896 decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal. In 1951, a group of 13 parents filed lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education. I always like to land on Topeka, right? Because most of my students think that this was a Southern case. This was a Midwestern case, right? This is Kansas. This isn't the former Confederacy. This is, in fact, a place that thought of itself as being relatively racially progressive. And so when the decision was unanimously handed down by the Warren Court on May 17, 1954, it effectively ended the legal justification for de jure segregation, which violated the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. But we didn't just get there in 1950. This groundwork was laid in the 1930s and 1940s. The NAACP legal team of Charles Houston, Thurgood Marshall, and Robert Carter, as well as other Black attorneys, began fighting in the course case by case for voting rights, for equalizing teacher salaries between Black and white teachers, for integrating higher education, integrating interstate public transportation, employment equality, equal access to housing, right? So they're beginning to chip away piece by piece with every court case, the legal justification for Plessy versus Ferguson. And the key moment here was Sweatt versus the University of Texas in 1950. So the University of Texas, which has a sizable Black population, was going to build a brand new swanky law school just for Black students. And what they began to argue was that there were relevant intangibles that being a student or an alumni of the University of Texas could offer, mostly access to its alumni group and its reputation. Therefore, a new Black law school could never be separate. It would always be separate, but never be equal. And so this became the new strategy for the NAACP, moving away from arguments based on equalization, the sheer denial of access to facilities, to an attack on the very premise behind segregated education. So this milestone that we see here was 20 plus years in the making. Oh, sorry, that was the court case. I'll remember next time. March on Washington. So the official title of this was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. In the summer of 1963, the Civil Rights Bill was stalled by bitter partisan fighting and filibusters. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy testified 10 times in support of the proposed legislation, to no avail. As Congress debated the bill, 250,000 civil rights proponents, which you see here, came and marched on Washington. And this included groups from a broad swath of religious, labor, and civil rights groups. And you should know that this very organization was also in attendance for the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. So, you know, this shows how important this is to a diverse group of people. But this was not just a moment. There's protests going on outside my window, which is why I looked at. See, it's happening in real time as well. So the first March on Washington movement was spearheaded by A. Philip Randolph in 1941, a labor organizer. He wanted to unite the working class and middle class African Americans. And he said, and I quote, "The March on Washington movement is essentially a movement of the people. It is all Negro and pro-Negro, but not for that reason anti-white or anti-Semitic or anti-Catholic or anti-foreign or anti-labor. Its major weapon is the nonviolent demonstration of Negro mass power." And FDR, President FDR, resisted this movement as long as he could until Walter White, the president of the NAACP, and Randolph met with him on June 18, 1941, about passing an equal Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in government employment, defense industries, and training programs, right? So expanding this growing industry during the wartime. The turning point, and this is one of my favorite history stories, the turning point came when FDR said, well, how many people are really going to march, right? Because he didn't want a massive group of people descending on Washington, D.C., the nation's capital during wartime. And so Walter White's eyes did not blink. He looked at him and said, 100,000, Mr. President. And then FDR said, you can't bring 100,000 Negroes to Washington. Someone might be killed. And then that's when Mayor LaGuardia, who is brokering the peace, says, gentlemen, it is clear that Mr. Randolph is not going to call off the march. And I suggest we begin to seek a formula, right? So mass protest was an effective tool to pass 8802. And the 1963 March on Washington was an effective tool to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The final kind of movement milestone that I want to hit here is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So often the story of Rosa Parks is told as this tired old woman who just had to sit on the bench. Couldn't be farther from the truth. First of all, at the time, Rosa Parks was only 42 years old. And as a woman whose age is advancing, that is sobering, right? 42 years old. The second thing is she was a highly trained and highly effective organizer who had been to the Highlander Folk School many, many times. So 4 days after the Brown decision in 1954, Joanne Robinson, an English professor, decided that her organization, the Women's Political Council, would write a letter to Montgomery mayor asking him to desegregate the buses, and if he didn't, they would begin a boycott. December 1st, 1955, Parks is arrested, and they decide that she is going to be the test case, even though others had previously been engaged in similar acts of civil disobedience. So Robinson and her co-workers mimeoed, right, those hand-cranked ways of making flyers, 30,000 pieces of paper at Alabama State College, and then her WPC volunteers put them on every car and on every front porch in the Black neighborhood. And then that Monday morning, the buses were empty. And this is the other thing that popular history doesn't tell us. And they remained empty for 381 days. So the capacity for a community to figure out how to get where they're going without buses for 381 days is tremendous, right? This was built on the principle of nonviolent direct action led by Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin is an incredible figure in history who has not been given his due until recently, because he was an openly gay man in a time in which to do so was not only, politically and socially catastrophic to your reputation, it was also illegal. And so he organized with A.J. Musty of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Musty introduced him to the teachings of Gandhi. Rustin went to India to learn, and he said of this, I think it's fair to say that Dr. King's view of nonviolent tactics was almost non-existent when the Montgomery Bus Boycott began. In other words, Dr. King was permitting himself and his children and his home to be protected by guns, right? So we have institutional knowledge, right? We have organizational knowledge. We have people ready to do that job on a moment's notice. And we also have the intellectual preparation through the nonviolent direct action process. And what this leads to is a ripple effect, right? So people were inspired by the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and so they began to have a sit-in movement, right? And these are just the places that had sit-ins from February 1st to April 14th, 1960, right? So if we think about this map and overlay it with what is happening today in real time, all the cities that have protests, it's remarkable. And those students and citizens who were activated went on to create the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of the most dynamic organizations of the movement, which led to the 1964 Freedom Summer, which led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which came on the heels of the Selma March. So this being prepared, right, having the organizational capacity actually launched an entire movement. We'll skip questions. So we have to ask ourselves, are we in a moment of changing same? How has race survived Obama, right? We had a Black president. This should have seen this moment where there was great promise and the evils of 300 years of racism in this nation would have been gone. Well, one way that people are understanding this is through colorblind racism, right? This is the assertion that one does not see color, ignoring the very real ways in which race affects our lives today. So one way is thinking about it through the idea of abstract liberalism, right? Meritocracy, bootstrapping. People who work hard are rewarded regardless of race, right? We all start off equally. But as the cartoon I opened with demonstrates, that's not the case. The second that justifies the current racial project is naturalization. Well, it's just the way things are. Black people hang out with Black people, Asian people hang out with Asian people. That's just how it is. Ignoring the real systems and structures in place that facilitate that type of segregation. If we think that the public school system, right, is oftentimes based on neighborhoods, and when people don't want their children to go to school with Black kids, they form new neighborhoods or charter schools or send their kids to private schools, other ways to get around this, right? So there's nothing natural about that. Cultural racism, this idea that inequality is based on the shortcomings of a particular race, right? So we see this in a lot when it comes to African Americans about, absentee fathers or crack babies, which are a myth, right? These things that the culture in and of itself is debased, and therefore that is why racism exists. And the final is the minimization of racism, right? And so this is a argument that's been, in the news lately, that there are just a few bad apples, right? There are just a few people who are acting in racist ways. It's not actually the whole system. It's not actually the whole story, right? It's just a few bad people. But we see this coming out in so many ways, right? Ferguson, ingredients: racism, inequality, distrust, despair, powerlessness, militarization, rage, made in the USA. Baltimore, The Wire, economic disparity, race, poverty, crime, right? All of these things have the explosive value. New Orleans, right? The levees that were built, keeping out people who are of different races, classes, those who are impoverished, those who are criminals or have criminal records, right? They are all lumped together and struggling, but while some people get to be protected from those things. And finally, from the summer, right? George Floyd, the spark, which led off isolation, frustration, poverty, fear, worry, unemployment, police, and health. So what do we make of this? So Black Lives Matter, I think, is a really important moment to understand kind of the parallel structure I've been doing today, right? The organizing that Black Lives Matter has done since George Zimmerman's acquittal after the murder of Trayvon Martin has really laid the groundwork, right? The organizational, institutional, and frankly, rhetorical structures needed to have this moment that we're in. So it was a movement put into motion by 3 queer women of color who at its very center has an intersectional understanding. So it's this idea that it's not just someone's racial identity, but also, if they are trans identified, if they are documented or undocumented, all of these things have a factor on how their life outcomes, right? The impact of structural violence in America today. As such, its platform, right? The Movements for Black Lives platform actually looks at all the ways in which that institutional or structural violence has impacted Black life. So they want to end the war on Black people in its many ways, offer reparations to help offset the economic harm that's been done, divest in things that harm the Black community, invest in things that help the Black community, economic justice, community control of the institutions that affect Black people's lives, and finally, political power. So where do we go from here? You guys have, generously given an hour of your evening to talk about this. There are lots of other things you could be doing. So you're already invested in it in a way that other folks have not. So one way to think about this is to understand your privilege and your role in the movements. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who's a great race theorist, said that white people need to become, quote, race traitors and call out other whites when they're being racist. And I love this phrase of his, that treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. So we can all collectively think about creating broad-based coalitions across race, classes, genders, sexual identities. We also need to listen to others' experiences objectively. Something that I often try to really emphasize in my class is seek first to understand, not be understood. And so when someone tells you about their experiences with racism or microaggressions or police, listen to them, right? Seek first to understand what they're saying before you start with, but did you do this? But did you have your license? But, right? Really listening to people's experiences objectively. And finally, I really take this idea to heart. And I think it's so important how it influences my work and how I see myself in these really, unprecedented but historical times, ones that are wholly new, but still very much rooted in the soil that I've been speaking about today. And this is from the scholar Gary Okihiro. And he has a fantastic book called Margins and Mainstreams. And in it, he writes, in fact, the margin has held the nation together with its expansive reach. The margin has tested and ensured the guarantees of citizenship, and the margin has been the true defender of American democracy, equality, and liberty. From that vantage, we can see the margin as mainstream. And for those of us who identify as the margin, I think this is such a powerful statement that we have the responsibility and we have already done the work to make this great nation make good on its promise of equality for all. With that, I just want to end with one last thing. I think it's always important to show, your work and what you have been reading and thinking about and have been citing. And these are the books that I've used for this presentation. And, I feel free to disseminate. But I really want to point your attention to the two books at the bottom. The first is by David Roediger, How Race Survived U.S. History. So really thinking about all of these moments where we could have gone beyond this racial project, but here we are. And I also love Jean Theo Harris's A More Beautiful and Terrible History, because this really discusses the complicated and often nefarious ways that civil rights movement history is now used to advance more conservative political agendas. And I think that's just a really smart book. And so in sum, please have faith, please have hope. Change is hard at first, messy in the middle, and of course, gorgeous at the end. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing all of your brilliant questions.